This is Chris Cayley, and in this video, I wanted to discuss some of the main drafting rules with some very specified types of bills. And there are some guidelines to keep in mind when you are drafting appropriations bills, urgency bills, special statute bills, state mandated local program bills, tax levy bills, and what we call double jointing amendments. We have in California some standardized language and recommended approach. They aren't formal rules found in statutes or main rules like that, but this is pretty much what you're going to be looking for in those bills. So with appropriations bills, there are three major requirements for drafting bills that make an appropriation of funds. First, in the relating clause, you'll always see the language "and making an appropriation therefore." The second one is in the Legislative Council's digest, and you'll find some language. You want a clear statement in the digest that the bill contains an appropriation, and so generally it'll say this bill would appropriate a sum of money from an identified fund like the general fund or a special fund and you'd identify the recipient fund for the purpose of a brief explanation specifying the use of the funds. And then the digest keys, appropriation will be yes, fiscal committee will be yes. Now, in addition and consistent with the California Constitution, three statements need to be in the actual statutory language in an appropriation bill. First, the expenditure authority is being given to a state officer. This could be a program or an agency or a state entity. Second, there's an ascertainable amount of funding, and this includes where the money is coming from. And then third, the funds are being appropriated for a particular purpose. And this usually includes, where the money is going. Turning to urgency bills, there are four major requirements when drafting an urgency bill. First, in the relating clause, you'll see and declaring the urgency thereof, to take effect immediately. Second, in the Legislative Council's digest, you'll see language typically at the end of the digest before the keys. It'll simply say this bill would declare that it is to take effect immediately as an urgency statute. The third, the vote key, of course, will be 2/3, since a 2/3 vote is required for an urgency statute. And then the fourth is that there's a standalone section at the end of the bill, a separate section of the bill that's not in code. It's called a plus section. And it always begins with a paragraph. This act is an urgency statute necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety within the meaning of Article 4 of the Constitution and shall go into immediate effect. The facts constituting the necessity are, and then there will be a paragraph below explaining it. And it always ends with, in order to, specifying the urgency, as quickly as possible, it is necessary for this act to take effect immediately. In turning to a special statute bill, there are two major requirements for drafting a bill that proposes a special rather than a general statute. The first you find in the Legislative Council's digest, where it'll say, this bill would make legislative findings and declarations as to the necessity of a special statute for, followed by a brief description. And then there will be a standalone section of the bill, not a code, a plus section, again, we call that. And it'll always have language that says, the legislature finds and declares that a special statute is necessary and that a general statute cannot be made applicable within the meaning of Section 16 of Article 4 of the California Constitution because of the unique circumstances and then council will briefly describe the unique nature and need for the bill. The next area is the state mandated local program bill. And here there are four major requirements, two included in the Legislative Council's digest for drafting a bill that creates a state mandated local program. First, in the Legislative Council's digest, it's made clear that the state mandated local program is related to the context in which the program is mandated. For example, in reading a bill, you might see language such as, by requiring local governments to do, you'd specify the activity. This bill would impose a state mandated local program. Similar language might be, by expanding the crime of, and then you specify the type of crime, comma, this bill would impose a state mandated local program. The second thing that's also in the Legislative Council's digest is language that's going to say something along the lines of, the California Constitution requires the state to reimburse local agencies and school districts for certain costs mandated by the state. Statutory provisions establish procedures for making that reimbursement. And then the next paragraph would be that this bill would provide that if the Commission on State Mandates determines that the bill contains costs mandated by the state, reimbursement for those costs shall be made pursuant to the statutory provisions noted above. Now, note that this language is not always the same because it is dependent upon whether the state mandated local program is or is not reimbursable. So the language I just read to you is default reimbursement language. However, there is other form language used depending on the type of state mandated local program. The third item is that the digest keys, fiscal committee, yes, and local program will be marked yes. And then the fourth item is that there will be a standalone section of the bill, again, uncodified, which we call a plus section at the end of the bill, that'll have language along the following lines. If the Commission on State Mandates determines that this act contains costs mandated by the state, reimbursement to local agencies and school districts for those costs shall be made pursuant to Part 7, commencing with Section 17500 of Division 4 of Title II of the Government Code. Note here as well that the type of form language that's used in the plus section varies again depending upon the type of state mandated local program that's contained in the bill. The next area or type of bill is a tax levy bill. And here there are 5 major elements for drafting a bill that is a tax levy. Remember, a tax levy is one that changes the base rate or burden of a tax. The first is in the relating clause, and you'll see language that says to take effect immediately, comma, tax levy. Second, in the Legislative Council's digest, you'll see language that is typically at the end of the digest, and it'll simply say, this bill would take effect immediately as a tax levy. Third, the digest keys will read either majority or 2/3 for the vote, 2/3 if it's a tax increase. If it's a tax decrease, then it's a majority. And the fiscal committee key will always be marked yes. The fourth thing is if the bill creates a new tax expenditure program, this is a new tax credit or incentive or exemption or exclusion, there will be, again, standalone language in a standalone section of the bill. It's not codified. We call this a plus section. And it includes language along the lines of, it's the intent of the legislature to comply with Section 41 of the Revenue and Taxation Code by, and then you would describe the goals, objectives, the evaluation criteria that would be used to evaluate this new tax expenditure program. The fifth is that there will also be standalone language at the end of the bill, again in a plus section, that says this act provides for a tax levy within the meaning of Article 4 of the California Constitution and shall go into immediate effect. The last type of specialized, it's not so much a bill, but rather amendments. This is to deal with the problem of chaptering out, where two or more bills amend the same code section with the last amended one taking effect. There are basically three major requirements when you're drafting a bill that requires double jointing amendments. These double jointing amendments are more commonly, but please note, are incorrectly referred to as chaptering out amendments. As the Office of Legislative Counsel likes to say, chaptering out is the problem that is addressed by the double jointing amendments. So the first item is in the Legislative Council's digest, and you'll see typically at the end of the digest language that says, for example, this bill would incorporate additional changes to section whatever of the particular code proposed by the other bill to be operative only if this bill and that other bill are enacted, and this bill is enacted last. Second, in the text of the bill, there will be what we call a 0.5 section. In other words, you have section 3, then 4, it'd be section 3.5. And it combines the changes to a particular code section that are found in the two bills, but that currently have different language to that same code section. The third is that there will be another standalone section at the end of the bill, uncodified, a plus section, that'll have language such as section 4.5 of this bill incorporates amendments to section 27A3 of the Labor Code proposed by both this bill and Assembly Bill 1506. That section of this bill shall only become operative if one, both bills are enacted and become effective on or before January 1, 2022, and two, that each bill amends section 2783 of the Labor Code, and three, that this bill is enacted after Assembly Bill 1506, in which case section 4 of this bill shall not become operative. So this language is not always the same because obviously it's dependent upon the specific circumstances of the chaptering out problem. But the language that I've just recited is sort of the default double jointing language. Don't forget that there could be multiple code sections and even multiple bills that would require more than one double jointing amendment. So there are obviously some other types of specialized bills that have their own unique drafting principles, but the ones that we have covered in this video podcast are some of the most common ones dealt with bill drafters in the state of California.